It was a quiet, cold night in early autumn, and I was working a late shift as an Uber driver in a small city. I didn't mind the late hours. It was peaceful, and the roads were mostly empty. On this particular night, the weather was a bit off. Fog had settled in, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The streetlights were dim, and the city seemed to be blanketed in silence. Around 2 a.m., I received a ride request. The passenger's destination was on the outskirts of town, near an old abandoned building. I thought it was odd. This part of the city had been quiet for years, and no one really went out there anymore, but it was a request, and I was working, so I accepted it. I arrived at the pickup location, and to my surprise, there was no one in sight. I sat there for a moment, checking the app to ensure I was in the right spot. The address matched, and I double-checked the time. Suddenly, the passenger appeared out of the fog, walking toward my car. I rolled down the window to confirm their name. "Are you Michael?" I asked, feeling a bit confused because he looked strange. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and wore dark sunglasses despite the fact that it was night-time and the fog was thick. He nodded slowly without saying a word and got into the back seat. We drove in silence for several minutes, but the entire time I felt a growing sense of unease. Something about this man's demeanor made me uncomfortable. He wasn't speaking at all, just staring out of the window. His face was pale, and the dim lighting from the streetlights made his features look even more ghostly. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question took me off guard. Not really," I answered hesitantly, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He was still staring out of the window, his face unreadable. "Why do you ask?" He paused for a long time before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm dead." I froze. For a split second I couldn't think. My heart started pounding, and I looked around to see if anyone else was on the road, but it was empty. "What do you mean by that?" I managed to say, trying to laugh it off. He didn't respond for a while, and when he finally did, his voice was cold, distant. "I died years ago. I'm just here for one last ride." My stomach churned. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just some strange joke. Maybe he was on something, or maybe it was just a weird prank. But the more I tried to focus on the road, the more uncomfortable I felt. It was as if the temperature in the car had dropped, and the air felt heavy with an unnatural stillness. When we reached the address, I slowed the car down, ready to let him off. The building loomed in front of us, dark and imposing, its windows boarded up. But then, as I came to a stop, I realized he hadn't moved. "Are you getting out?" I asked, turning to look at him. My voice was shaky now. He was still sitting there staring at me, but his face, it looked different. His eyes were now fully black with no whites at all, and his skin had turned an eerie shade of grey. The temperature in the car had dropped significantly. The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I wanted to drive away, but my hands were frozen on the steering wheel. I could barely breathe. Then, in a soft voice, he said, "Thank you for the ride." Before I could react, the man disappeared right before my eyes. One moment he was sitting in the back seat, and the next there was nothing but the lingering coldness of his presence. I jerked forward in my seat, my heart racing. When I got home, I parked the car and sat there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I was shaking uncontrollably. I knew I'd just experienced something I couldn't explain, something that was beyond anything I'd ever believed in. Later, I found out something strange. That old building had been abandoned for over a decade. There were no residences nearby, and when I went back to look at the spot where I'd picked up Michael, there was no trace of him, no footprints, nothing. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely. But the experience left me with an undeniable sense of unease. There are some things in life that can never be fully understood, and that ride is one of them. This story, while chilling, serves as a reminder that not all encounters can be easily explained. Whether paranormal or not, some things just can't be forgotten, and they leave an everlasting impression.